Joining us now on the Oakland County Megacast, Dave Boucher. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Thank you for being with us. Your initial thoughts when you saw what was happening on the nation's capital yesterday?
Yeah, so I think we went into yesterday understanding that there was a chance that some members of Congress could try to object to the results, the electoral results for Michigan. And so my colleague and I were preparing to, observe what we assumed to be a relatively routine congressional debate over allegations of election fraud. We've covered out these allegations for a long time. All of them that we've, faced have been refuted and debunked through lots of evidence. And so we were preparing for that. We were
And
not
so,
preparing.
Dave, if I can interrupt you for a second, just so people know, typically this is it's very common. It happens every 4 years. It typically takes 30 minutes or less. But
Yep.
you even knew that it was probably going to be more, but still didn't anticipate this.
That's exactly right. It's generally procedural. And while Democrats and Republicans in the past have objected, it's not really come down to an actual formal debate, and no objections have really changed anything. This concept of sending competing slates of delegates to Congress is exceptionally rare, and it's not something that really happens all that often. And it was not intended to happen all that often. But to your point, right, we didn't anticipate that there would be a mass riot and mob that would overtake the U.S. Capitol yesterday. I thought it was interesting, the concept of not expecting something like that to happen. The president has said for months, even before the election, that if he didn't win, the election would be rigged. He's perpetuated conspiracy theories about mail-in voting and other forms of fraud or allegations that just aren't true. And he has fired up his base to believe that anything to the contrary is a smear and a lie and a tactic to undermine democracy. And, his supporters, vocal supporters, his family, Rudy Giuliani and others have said the exact same thing. Yesterday, in front of thousands of people, Rudy Giuliani voiced that there should be, quote, trial by combat. I don't think it's a huge surprise when the president's supporter is calling for trial by combat that people would rush the U.S. Capitol. I don't think that's a huge shock. So the concept that yesterday was a peaceful protest, even from the outset, is a little bit disingenuous, I would say. Again, especially because the president has repeatedly fomented conspiracy theories about election fraud.
Dave Boucher with us here on the Oakland County Megacast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. As you're watching what's going on in D.C., what are you thinking about how it relates to Michigan? Because we've been a key player throughout this entire election.
Yeah, I mean, some of my first thoughts were about protests in the state capitol in Michigan, and about a very widely covered alleged plot to kidnap and kill Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and how President Trump at times said that the governor essentially wasn't grateful enough to the FBI for thwarting that attack, and politicized, attempted kidnapping and murder of the governor of Michigan. Obviously, the governor has also taken political swipes at the president. That's not a surprise. But when you see when you see the president tell groups like the Proud Boys, who are, a hate group, to stand back and stand by, and then we see members of the same organization storm the Capitol, you can see parallels between the allegations of threats against elected officials in Michigan as well. It's not a huge A to B to C to get to that. So those were some of my first thoughts. We've also seen a lot of calls, both from the congressional delegation, the Democrats, and the congressional delegation for impeachment or for evoking the 25th Amendment. And we've seen calls at the state legislative level to condemn state lawmakers who have supported some of these allegations of fraud and some of these attempts to undermine the election. And also state legislators who've supported renewed calls for banning guns in the state capitol.
Dave Boucher with us from the Detroit Free Press. He is one of their government and politics reporters with us today on the Oakland County Megacast. And Dave, you did touch on it briefly there. The discussion that's been had on the state level previously, especially after the previous incidents at the Michigan Capitol regarding the allowance of firearms at the Capitol in the state of Michigan and Lansing. After the events of yesterday at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., has those discussions in Lansing or within Lansing politics, obviously it's going to be reignited. on the Democratic side of the aisle, but from Republicans on the other side as well. Has that conversation advanced at all to where there could be some decisions coming forward regarding security, particularly with regards to weapons at the Michigan Capitol?
I haven't seen that. It certainly might be happening. All of this is happening very quickly, and I, just like pretty much everybody else, was pretty hyper focused on what was happening in Washington D.C. yesterday. But yeah, I have seen some tweets and statements from Democrats at the Michigan level who would like to see that change. There's debate on whether or not that's something that should be led by the State Capitol Commission, the entity that's kind of in charge of the rules and regulations of the state capitol, versus the actual lawmakers who were there. I don't think if Republicans and Democrats agreed that there shouldn't be guns at the Capitol, then that would probably be a rule that would be instituted. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not that happens. I mean, there's a new Speaker of the House, Jason Wentworth, a Republican from Clare. I don't know how he stands on the issue. I know that, just like many Republicans, he's an advocate for gun rights. So we'll see. But no, I haven't seen like a huge bipartisan push in the last 12 hours to change that rule. Obviously, that could change. It's still very early.
Dave Boucher with us here on the Oakland County Mega Cast. You're listening to 89.3 WBLD Orchard Lake, 88.1 WBFH in Bloomfield Hills. And Dave, if we can kind of continue this conversation, does this give fuel to the individuals that are pushing for the gun ban at the state capitol? Does this give them fuel to their argument to actually get this passed in 2021?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think it's the fact that some of the men who have been accused of trying to plot to kidnap and kill the governor also brought guns into the state capitol earlier this year. And we have that, documented from federal and local law enforcement, and that didn't prompt a change to the rule. I'm not sure that people storming the Capitol in D.C. will change that. It might. It certainly might. It obviously is adding fuel for the Democrats, who have been pushing for that for a while, but obviously the Republicans control the legislature. They're in the majority party. So, it's certainly, in theory, could help Democrats, kind of put this issue on the fore again, but it's unclear whether or not it's going to make any difference.
So I'm really fascinated with the case involving the governor and this plot against her, because you may not have been around in Detroit a few years ago under the Hutari investigation, in which many of them were kind of let off because the argument was this was First Amendment. They were just spouting, their ideologies and things of that nature. And you wonder if this is going to be the same outcome, or can the feds actually make a case? Did they learn from that case and the political fallout from the case long term? Because people need to understand some of these criminal investigations do play out into the laws that are enacted here within our state.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is innocent until proven guilty in the United States. And so obviously the people who have been accused in this case are going through their the judicial proceedings as is their right. The evidence that the FBI and local law enforcement has presented so far includes video, audio, images, reports of finding a fair amount of explosives, a fair amount of guns. They also apparently have sources who were inside the organization who have provided direct communication, indicating real threats, including but not limited to staking out the governor's private residence and plans to take the governor allegedly to Wisconsin for a sham trial before she was executed. Obviously, we'll see how this plays out, but the evidence that has been presented so far, the FBI would want you to know, and the local law enforcement would want you to know, is a lot, and it's credible.
So Dave Boucher with us here on the Oakland County MegaCast. You're a reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Your predictions for 2021 in the state of Michigan and our arena of politics.
Yeah, so that's a fair question. Although it's not an election year, every year is essentially an election year, so we'll see what happens. We found out yesterday that Laura Cox, who is the chairwoman of the Michigan Republican Party, is not going to seek that role again, and so it'll be interesting to see the dynamics. It looks like some of the people who might be in leadership there are, equally as supportive of the president. I think that it's fair to say that there is and this happens every time especially when there's a loss at the presidential level, that there's competing factions within the Republican Party, people who argue that the president was bad for Republican politics and bad for the country, and people who are ardent Trump supporters, like your last caller. And so that's a dynamic that's going to play out in Michigan and at the national level. There'll be a potentially, I don't want to call it a comparable dynamic, but there's also obviously a division in the Democratic Party as well between so-called moderates and people who are a little bit further to the left. We'll see how that plays out with the Biden administration. I think it is worth noting, now that the Democrats have control of the U.S. Senate, that Michigan's 2 U.S. senators, Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters, are both in line to become committee chairmen and chairwomen. Obviously, when you have members of your state delegation who are the heads of committees, that tends to convey them a little bit more power. So Gary Peters is in line to be the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and Debbie Stabenow is in line to be the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee. And so again, those are powerful positions. The U.S. Senate is split 50-50, and so Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will be the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. But chair people tend to be able to help dictate what legislation even appears before the committee, and so that's a lot of power for Senators Peter and Stabenow. So it'll be interesting to see what they take up, what they want their priorities to be, and how that actually and whether that leads to any new legislation or ideas.
Michigan has definitely come out as a major power player in the election process, not just this past presidential election, but previous ones as well. But going forward, are we going to gain more power or lose more power coming out of the Trump administration?
I don't know. I think that's there's a lot of different ways to look at it. From a purely representative government position, the state is expected to lose at least one member of the congressional delegation due to the census. Every 10 years, the country conducts the census, and members of Congress are appropriated based on the number of people that live in the state. Michigan has lost a lot of people in the last 10 years, and so it's expected that the delegation could lose a seat in Congress. Right now, there are 16 representatives, 2 senators, and 14 members of Congress, of the House, excuse me. The state's expected to at least lose 1 seat. So obviously, just from a purely representative position, there's going to be 1 less vote in Michigan. It's unclear. I mean, as you know, Michigan's something of a purple state. The president won the state in 2016 by roughly 10,700 votes, but President-elect Biden won the state this time by about 154,000 votes. It's unclear. I mean, there's an argument that the nonpartisan redistricting commission that was established through a voter drive several years back will reapportion not only the congressional districts, but also the state legislative districts in a way that is arguably more reflective of the state. It's worth noting that the state has 2 U.S. senators who are Democrats. The governor's a Democrat, the Secretary of State's a Democrat, the Attorney General's a Democrat, and Republicans overwhelmingly control both the House and the Senate at the state level. There's an argument that there's a disconnect there, and that it's interesting to see whether or not redistricting will change that. It might not. It certainly might not. There are obviously lots of places throughout the state where there's a ton of Republican support. So redistricting is definitely something I'm watching, and we'll see. We'll see how the power of Michigan changes under a Biden administration.
But what about the relationship between the governor and the president-elect? Biden and Whitmer seem to have a pretty good relationship. In fact, some people thought she was in the running for the vice presidency. And what does that relationship mean for the state of Michigan during his presidency?
Yeah, I think everybody, Republican or a Democrat, would want their governor to at least have a working, functional relationship with the federal government. If for no other reason than it could help get federal assets or federal aids or anything else, to help work together. And you're right, the governor appears to have a pretty good relationship with President Biden. She was definitely on the short list to be a possible VP candidate. So that could help. I mean, I think right now the number one thing that most residents are looking at when it comes to the relationship between the governor and the federal government is the COVID vaccine and the distribution and rollout of that vaccine. The state has hundreds and thousands of doses, but has run into some challenges with actually getting those doses injected into people's arms. And the governor has said that that's due to, in part, a failure to communicate effectively with the federal government, or the federal government's, more precisely, the federal government's failure to communicate with the states. Other states are also working with the federal government and have a higher percentage of people vaccinated. And so that's definitely a question that will be that we're going to continue to ask moving forward.
Yeah, Dave Boucher with us here on the Oakland County Megacast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And with that, Dave, when you're talking about the COVID vaccine, I will say when it's the finger pointing, I think both sides will say, we're tired of the finger pointing. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People are dying. They're losing their businesses. They're going hungry. And on top of that, we just saw the display on the nation's capital that we saw yesterday that I think no one in our lifetimes would think that we would ever see. And you also wonder about the long-term effects about yesterday and what the message it sends across not just the nation, but the world as well. But again, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Stop the finger pointing. But can these two sides come together in the state of Michigan? Because I will say Governor Whitmer, she's been the first point. Every single press conference that she has held has pointed the finger at the federal government and Trump specifically. I would imagine that's going to end when Biden takes office.
Potentially. I would imagine that if the state still faces issues 3 months from now with getting the vaccine actually administered to people, that maybe that frustration will remain. But I agree that there's obviously less animosity between Governor Whitmer and President Biden. I do think it's worth noting that the governor and the Republican-controlled legislature has worked together on some initiatives, specifically around COVID. They worked together in the late summer and early fall on a pretty big education plan that kind of gave some flexibility to districts on how they wanted to institute COVID measures. And it was, again, it was bipartisan, and they worked together on it. They worked together on criminal justice reform this year. But yeah, there's been a lot of finger pointing from the governor and Republicans in the legislature about some aspects of COVID relief. And yeah, you can argue that both sides have some, can take some of the blame, but finger pointing in politics is I don't want to say it's foundational, but it's certainly common and unfortunately expected. So yeah, on one hand, people are tired of it. And on the other hand, people are going to continue to do it. I think that was indicative of the conversation you had with your previous caller, that people are both frustrated and exceedingly ready to point the finger at themselves. So do I think that partisan rhetoric will die down? No, absolutely not. I mean, we saw last night when Congress came back after hundreds of rioters stormed the Capitol. One person died after being shot. 3 other people died due to medical conditions. 14 people were arrested. We saw there are reports that 2 members of Congress had to be separated because they were going to get in a fist fight related to whether or not electoral votes should be accepted. That was hours after people stormed the Capitol. So no, I don't think any of that's going to change. Frankly, I don't know why it would.
Well, it definitely doesn't do anything to help the divide that is within our country right now. Hey, before we let you go, though, can we talk about COVID relief in the state of Michigan?
Sure.
I know the governor yesterday, her press conference was pretty much overshadowed with the events that took place out of the nation's capital yesterday. Yeah. But one of the things that they are saying is that starting next Monday, it is going to be expanded. The vaccination program is going to be expanded.
Yep.
But also, we have to recognize that it's one of the reasons it's being expanded is because there are a lot of people that it's available to who are saying, not going to do it just yet.
Yeah, we have heard for a variety of reasons that people who are in that top priority list haven't gotten the vaccine yet. We've heard, for example, from hospitals who say they had anticipated vaccinating workers, but they couldn't vaccinate like an entire floor of people at one time because just like any other vaccine, sometimes there are side effects. And if too many people, had to miss a day of work because of side effects, that would actually hurt their ability to serve as a hospital. There have been other frontline workers who have just refused to take the vaccine for whatever reason. It's worth noting that there's been more than 120,000 people who have received the vaccine. The state's quick to note that Michigan is 11th, at least it was yesterday, when it comes to terms of the total number of people who have been administered the first dose of the vaccine. However, looking at the same statistics, the state is 40th when it comes to per capita number of people who have been administered the vaccine. You're right, the state is broadly expanding who can get the vaccine, in addition to firefighters, police officers, correctional officers. They're extending it more broadly to anyone who is 65 and older. I've gotten a dozen calls and emails this morning about how to make that work, how people are supposed to get their appointments. Michigan.gov/COVID vaccine, where the state's telling you to go. There's a big blue box there that says COVID vaccine. You click on it, and there's supposed to be information for individual county health departments about how to sign up. Now, I will caution, the vast majority of health departments do not have information on that site yet. So if you are interested in getting that vaccine, I would tell you to go to that website and see if your information is there, or to call your local health department. As you noted, Ronnie, this doesn't roll out until Monday. You can't start getting this until Monday, but we anticipate many counties are going to start coming more online with an appointment apparatus so that people can start at least getting in line virtually for these vaccines. The governor did note that it's really important for people to actually make these appointments ahead of time. She and the state don't want long lines of people, crowding together and waiting for this vaccine for hours. We've seen that happen in other states. She and others in the state would argue that is actually a great way to catch COVID. So they're telling people to avoid doing that. But yes, this is a huge next step for the state of Michigan in rolling out its vaccinations.
And so we want to also let you know that if you're looking for that link, if you go to civiccentertv.com, click on coronavirus, you'll find the headline, and there is a link to the state of Michigan for you to be able to easily access that information. Dave Boucher with us here on the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Great to have you with us. And I have to just note out behind you, I see your Detroit map and your Charleston map. Is that Charleston, South Carolina?
No, that's Charleston, West Virginia. I am a proud former resident of Charleston, West Virginia. I covered the state capitol there for several years with the local newspaper. And so I have that. I also used to live in Dallas and have a nice Dallas map as well.
Oh, I didn't see Dallas because it was behind you. So
Yeah.
I went to college at the College of Charleston in South Carolina.
Sure.
So
Sure. No, I've visited. It's a delightful city. I definitely think most people, when they think of Charleston, think of South Carolina. But no, I lived in West Virginia, and I'm proud of it.
that's because Charleston, South Carolina is the best place to live. Go Cougars. With that, though, Dave, we want to say thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it, and we appreciate your insight and your knowledge as well.
Sure. Thanks for having me.